So this is lecture 1. We formally begin the topic of optimization in machine learning. For today, we will focus on applications. We'll begin with applications of continuous optimization and then we'll move on to discrete optimization. I don't think we'll have time for discrete optimization because we'll spend a little bit of time understanding the examples. Of course, we may not be able to take them to their logical conclusion because we will need the tools of optimization to solve them. But let's get started. So the first application is supervised learning. Any standard machine learning course begins with problems such as classification or regression. And the idea in classification is that your labels are all plus minus 1, whereas in regression you're dealing with labels which are continuous valued. Sometimes you may also want them to be discrete. So this is an example from classification where your labels could be plus or minus 1. Okay. As against regression, this is in classification. In regression, they're real valued. Minus 1 plus 1 or plus minus, that's both are equivalent. Okay. Now there are several different models depending on the applications. For example, if you may have a problem such as email spam filtering, where you're trying to map the x and y axis to features. The features could be words that occur in the text. They could be phrases that have been manually identified. They could be embeddings or handwritten digit recognition, where you're trying to recognize a digit on its completion. Features are again images, label is a digit. So house price prediction, where the features are house properties such as square feet rather, number of bedrooms, bathrooms location, and the label is the cost. Now the last example is that of a continuous uh, prediction problem where the label y is continuous. So how do you solve these problems typically? So here's how you would model them. I would like this to be interactive, so please pause, please ask me questions, and at times I will also be asking you questions. The slides, by the way, are all there. I have uploaded slides from the last year, so you'll find many. I mean, the sequence is probably the same, but some topics I'm going to go over fast and so that we can cover discrete optimization better. So please go to Moodle. You'll find the previous year slides which we are building upon. There's a lot more detailing I would have done in this year's slides. So with that note, what is the basic idea? We are trying to learn a transformation from my input x with a potential set of weights. So x itself could be, as I said, a feature vector, and you could use w transpose or theta transpose. We would use both of them interchangeably. Mapping, what we would map to is y, but not necessarily directly. What we would have between on this arrow is often a generalized linear function. Okay. So let me make some space. And these when we say generalized linear functions, you could also extend them to nonlinear functions. So typically we would just denote this by f. Okay. So that even if y is a probability value associated with classes +1 and -1, you your generalized linear function is able to accommodate the translation. So this y which you're talking about could be the probability of a positive label given the example x, or y itself could be w transpose x. So you could have the f being an identity function. Any question? It's also possible that you could have deep models as recursive functions, and this is being shown here. So you don't have just one transformation. I've used theta instead of w, so maybe to be consistent, let me use theta here as well. Okay. So the theta is the set of weights associated with the features. So you could also have recursive applications. F1, which could be one kind of activation unit. If you're familiar with deep learning, you could have ReLU. F2 could be sigmoid. FL could be, again a ReLU. So you could have the same thing repeating. So the loss function L tries to measure how far the final capital F is from the Y. Okay. So they're trying to measure the distance between this F theta xi and Y. And how is the F obtained? So yes, this F is obtained exactly as shown in this figure. Let me make this capital F here. To be consistent. So this is capital F. Okay, so what the loss is trying to do is measure the distance between this F and the Y. Um, it's possible that on some occasions, some of these F1, F2 you might be able to absorb into the L. Right? So what goes into the F and what goes into the L can be a slightly subjective decision, right? So you could apply a transformation on the F or the theta transpose X within L itself. But let's assume for the time being that we try to make the loss as simple as possible. We'll not try and play hide and seek between the F's. We'll make them explicit. We'll not hide them within the L. Okay. So with this, here's the general loss plus regularizer framework, which is something that will cover the entirety of most of neural networks and their variants, most of traditional classification models. It's this loss plus regularizer framework where the loss is this first component and the regularizer is a second component. So I would like to hear from all of you, what is this regularizer doing here? If you have an exposure to machine learning, obviously you'd be able to recall, but I'll be adding some more perspectives. So
When we train a particular data, so after training, we see underfitting or overfitting. So to decrease the variance after testing, we use to decrease the loss, we use that regularization.
you used a bunch of terminology here. You said you're trying to reduce the variance, um, possibly by increasing the bias. May I say that?
Yes, sir.
Increasing the bias of the model. You're trying to bias the model to what? To simpler thetas.
Yes, sir.
The extreme case, the thetas might just become zeros, right? So we'll take examples where the notion of simplicity would be measured in terms of, say, the magnitude in terms of the norm. So increase the bias, increasing the bias of the model. Sorry. Uh, Yield thetas that are simpler, okay, smaller norms. Okay. That's what you're all familiar with. This is also associated with a prior, right? The putting a increasing bias is like adding a prior. Is that correct? So I have some extra optional slides at the end. Let me just run through them quickly. Okay. Um, so this is after all the applications. I've just given some extra slides so that they remain. So this is a, let's say lasso. Okay, and you'll see the kind of regularizers. This is an example of regularizer. So these basically are telling you, um, you can forget the mu and the b for the time being, but these are basically telling you where you would like most of the thetas to lie. Okay, so this is telling that okay, the red one says the thetas should be increasingly at 0. That's a prior, right? So you could have a slightly more benign prior, or your prior could be peaking somewhere else. So these are different priors on theta. And what do they say? They opine, or they give the opinion on where the maximum values, uh, where the values must be concentrated, right? Okay, and I'll come back to this this Laplacian tortoise and Gaussian here later on. Let's go back. Okay, so yeah, so that's one purpose of regularizer, adding that prior where those points should peak. Does anyone else want to give another purpose of a regularizer?
Sometimes using a prior will help in arriving at solution in much more simpler way, I would say.
Okay, arriving at a solution in simpler, actually that's content. One aspect of this course is the problem becomes better behaved, well behaved. For example, algorithms can converge faster. So in this course specifically, there's another purpose that the prior would um, serve. The prior, we see basically makes the optimization problem well behaved through notions of strong convexity, okay, or related concepts. So the strong convexity is like saying, okay, I have a convex function and there is kind of guaranteed gap that this convex function has from say a quadratic. Okay, so optimization problem well behaved to a property, to properties on convexity. And when you say strong convexity, strong, it could be local or global convexity. So okay, when we say convexity, we'll generally mean it's in that in a region. So somehow, no matter how much you deal with non-convex optimization, you can't escape convexity. Convexity is there even in non-convex problems because of the regions, right? So through properties such as strong local or global convexity, the optimization problem can become well behaved. And what is the result? Right? Resulting in uh, faster convergence rates of optimization algorithm. They'll just converge faster. Okay. Yeah, largely these are some sufficiently broad enough reasons to have the regularizer. And let's take some examples. So the simplest example of the loss function that you would know with a simple f theta x is theta transpose x is the p squared loss. If y is, I say, the real valued vectors. So let's say y's are in, so n is the number of examples. So let's say we use scalar to begin. Let's just take them to be scalar. Let's say y is r, and then you would have L as just simply the norm, or just the square, right? This is for the ith component. So you'll basically say theta transpose xi minus yi square. That's an example. But let's take a whole bunch of other examples. What we took is this least squared loss. But there are a whole bunch of other examples depicted here in this figure. Let me zoom in. Is this clear enough? Do I need to zoom in further?
No, sir.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe we can try and recap. If you have done a basic course on machine learning, you'd be probably familiar with some of these loss functions. So the black one is basically the step loss. It's also called the 0-1 loss. Now, what's the problem with the step loss? Is a step loss which basically amounts to, okay, so the step losses. Yeah, here, this one. Is it continuous? Is it differentiable?
It is not differentiable.
Is it continuous even?
No, sir.
Okay, so step loss is neither continuous nor differentiable. Okay, so there are other surrogates we come up with. What the step loss says, which is intuitive, is that if my classification is wrong, right? Basically, if the predicted label does not agree with the true label, y is a true label, fx is a predicted label for classification. If they don't agree, that the sign is negative, then you have a loss of 1. Otherwise, you have a loss of 0. So to make it continuous and also differentiable, there are options. So the first example is in green, which is basically a hinge loss. Okay, so this you see this hinge loss in green. This is continuous but not differentiable everywhere. Where is it not differentiable? Let's go back to the image here. Where is it not differentiable?
At 1.
Yeah, only at 1. It's continuous everywhere, but not differentiable only at 1. Okay, so still well behaved, and we'll see that there are ways of dealing with functions which are not differentiable at some finite number of points. There's the notion of subgradient at such points, and you can have a notion of gradient which is at all of the points where the function is differentiable. And you could think of subgradient descent algorithms too, which also have some convergence properties under certain assumptions. Okay, so it's not that bad a surrogate, right? It's an upper bound. It's actually always an upper bound. But let's look at alternatives, which probably will be more satisfying from the point of view of differentiability. So then we see this exponential loss, exp minus of y into fx. Have you seen this anywhere? One in blue. Of course, that has been transformed using a log transformation here. Have you seen this? Okay, you can have an exp of minus y times. If you've done ADA boost, anyone has done ADA boost? Boosting. Okay. So in boosting, such as ADA boost, this loss is used. However, a related loss is what we find in the form of likelihood, in the form of cross entropy as well. I mean, they just turn out to be related transformations. Okay, so you can have the softmax loss, which is basically associating an exp exponent with the theta transpose x, but there's a theta corresponding to every class c equals 1 to k. Okay, and you can see that that's continuous and differentiable everywhere. Of course, now you can think of many other functions, but some others have been presented here. Absolute error, which is looking at the mod of the difference between the predicted and the true value. Right? And you can see that that would again have the problem of differentiability at some finite number of points. So this overall loss plus regularizer framework, but what about the regularizer itself? Yeah, I mean, logistic loss, I assume all of you are okay with it, because this is you can think of as a special case of the softmax loss. Let's move on to the regularizer, unless you have more questions. Okay. But by the way, what loss does perceptron optimize? Let me ask some questions. I want to make sure you all tuned in. So this is
the hinge loss.
Okay. So perceptron optimizes the hinge loss. Can you think of any other model you have studied so far for classification? Gaussian discriminant analysis. What would it try and maximize? It's possible that your the loss we're talking about is not even listed here. Anyone? What does Gaussian discriminant analysis optimize? Likelihood loss. So we haven't listed that explicitly here, though in several settings it will be related to the logistic or softmax loss. So you could look at the probability of generation rather than the probability of discrimination. That's what Gaussian discriminant analysis does. But if you look at the probability of discrimination, that's also a likelihood, which is what logistic loss corresponds to. Okay. We are not again looking at multiple transformations like the maximum likelihood estimate or maximum conditional likelihood estimate for the logistic regression model is the logistic loss we are talking about here. So there are many other losses possible. You can feel free to list more. Okay, let's continue. So now what are examples of the regularizer? Now this is interesting. As I said, the regularizer can play a critical role in convergence. So L1 and L2 are very well known standard regularizers. The L1 regularizer interestingly brings more sparsity than the L2 regularizer. And I'm going to demonstrate that through some simple Colab notebook. But before we complete that story, let me go to the extra optional slides at the end. So I'll be showing you this contrasting level curves of the L1 and the L2 norms. Okay, this Colab link, I'll just post it here as well on the on our chat, and I'm going to screen share that. Okay, hope you can see this. And let me know if you are able to open this Colab notebook. This is something I show in my basic optimization course, in my machine learning course, but I'm just going to focus on this, the L2 norms level curves. As you can see, they are well, basically concentric circles, but they could also be ellipsoids if you look at some transform space of the original vector, but they're largely concentric circles or ellipsoids. Whereas if you look at the L1 norm, sorry, if you look at the L1 norm, this is exactly how they will look like. They look like kites, concentric kites. And in addition, in contrast to, as I said, these concentric circles or ellipsoids. Okay. Now, what is the implication of one norm with respect to the other? At least in the case of a simple linear regression versus the ridge regression versus the lasso, let's look at them. So this lambda is the weightage associated with the regularizer. Okay, and this is the case when your regularizer is the L1 norm regularizer. So as your weightage to the regularizer increases, you'll find that the model from being from being a non-linear regression becomes increasingly linear, in fact becomes dumb and flat for very large values of lambda. If you inspect the behavior of the weights themselves, that's interesting. For large values of lambda, you'll find that lots of the weights just actually go to 0. As I said, I'll use W's and thetas interchangeably. A lot of the W's go to 0, and if I just count the number of W's that go to 0, but higher values of lambda, I mean pretty much all of them start going to 0, except maybe for 1 or 2, right? So this is interesting. However, if I use an L2 norm instead, let's go to the chart above. You'll find that the lambdas become diminishingly small. These actually become very, very small. Sorry, the weights become very small. It's a very, very small weights. However, the actual number of 0 weights is never non-trivial. It's always 0. There's always 0 here. The weights become small, their norms become small, but the weights actually never go to 0. Now, why is this interesting? This can be interesting if you want sparse solutions, if you want to store models, infer on models very effectively, store models in a memory efficient manner, and also if you want generalization. You don't want some of the coefficients to be hanging around for no good reason. And that's what Lasso tries and insists, that there must be some reason why weights are non-zero. But here, all the weights are non-zero, no matter how insignificantly small they are. Okay, so well, why does this happen? Yeah, this is just showing the errors. But why does this happen? Let's go back to, if you have questions on this, let me know. Otherwise, I'll move back to the slides. You can feel free to navigate the Colab notebook as well.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
So what did you mean by sparsity when you said that L1 regularizer has, promotes sparsity? I did not understand.
So what L1 regularizer does, let's look at it from the point of view of the level curve. Sorry. Okay, those what L1 regularizer does is it has a tendency to push some of the solutions to the corners. I mean, tendency to push solution to corners. Now, there could be corners which have more non-zero W's than some other corners, right? So, but the corners are guaranteed to have at least some non-zero, some zero W's, right? So, there's no such notion of a corner in the L2 case. I mean, in a house which is kind of spherical, you would really not find dust accumulating, right? Physics also has a role to play here. Why you would not have dust accumulating I mean, there's nothing like a corner here, so dust accumulates anyway everywhere. But you know that in a typical house, the corners are where the dust tends to congregate. Similarly, solutions also tend to congregate towards corners. I can give an algorithmic explanation little later, So what we are trying to say is L1 norm tends to give you solutions which have lots of zero components. Okay, again going back to the plot below, if you count the number of zero components for large values of lambda, there are lots of zero components, means lots of weights which are just being pushed to zero. That is a sparse solution. So sparse solution is these are very sparse solutions. Does that help? Those with lots of zero weights are sparse solutions.
Yes, sir, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, more questions, welcome. Every question will be entertained with respect.
Sir?
Yes, you want me to go back to this?
No, sir, I had a question.
Uh-huh.
Sir, what if we use L1 and L2 together in equal proportions? Which one will dominate or something like that?
That's interesting. So there are mixed norms. Depends on the weight. That depend on the trade-off weight. Difficult to
So
see how.
suppose they're equally proportionate.
Suppose they are equally.
Suppose they're equal in proportion, like the lambda is common to both the norms.
That's an interesting question. Actually, it also depends a bit on the data set, right? So if you find that some of the features are indeed meaningless, they're redundant. So if I have one feature and let's say another copy of the same feature, or maybe a scaled version of that feature, I mean linear combination of the two features, then when you take a mixture of the two, lasso will kind of start dominating, because there's actually redundant in the sense lasso will make a difference. But if there's no redundancy at all, then lasso doesn't have so much to. I mean, it will almost be dominated by the L2 norm. So I would say it also depends a bit on the data set. But if you're just talking about optimizing only a mixture of the two norms without the data set, right? So one is tie the two W's through the data set. But if you were to just say take a mixture of W2 and W1 norm, that'll be an interesting experiment to do. I would guess that they both have an equal role to play, because there's no reason one should be preferred over the other. Does that help?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the other thing that happens is I just want to show the algorithm. Yeah, this is the algorithm. Sorry. Algorithmically, we can understand what's happening. So the lasso estimate, this will come later on. This is iterative soft thresholding algorithm. This is obtained using proximal gradient descent. This is a name, but what the algorithm does basically, and it converges. Okay, it says that if my W estimate for any ith coordinate, if that is between minus lambda and plus lambda, then push it to 0. Okay, this is the key. 0 otherwise, right? It's saying that if it's between minus lambda eta is a step size which is used in descent algorithms, and the lambda is the weightage given to the one norm. So in the case of lasso, what happens is that if your weight turns out to be between minus lambda eta and plus lambda eta, it'll be killed basically. It'll be suppressed. It'll be pushed to 0. Okay, so that's how it's capturing redundancy. Sorry, there's some disturbance. Someone's attempting to ask a question. Yourself if you are not. So algorithmically you can understand why this propensity to have sparse solutions is because the proximal step and the steady state is lambdas that the W's will turn out to be tend to be between either greater than lambda eta or less than minus lambda eta. Some scaled version of lambda will lower bound, and some scaled version of minus lambda will upper bound the negative lambdas and right. Vice versa, the positive lambdas are lower bounded by a scale version of the lambdas. So this algorithmically also we'll have an explanation later on why this happens. But if there are no questions, I'll proceed with other examples.
Sir, what is relative drop?
Which slide did you see that in?
The lasso slide.
Lasso slide, okay. While relative drop in E-lasso, basically while the drop in the lasso error, this is the lasso error. Okay, so what we are saying is while the drop in the lasso error across 2 iterations is significant, that means there's some the loss. Let me write this expression for relative loss. Relative drop, sorry. So you look at the E-lasso error is dropping. So you look at the error in the kth step minus say the error in the k plus 1 step, the whole divided by the, that's what is where relative is coming in, the whole divided by the error of lasso at the kth step. Does that help?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
We are assuming that there'll be a drop, so we didn't put an absolute value, but ideally you should use an absolute value. Okay. Any other question?
Excuse me, sir. Sir, that drop, why is it that it is significant compared to the last iteration? I mean, if we go iteration by iteration, then after some k iteration, many of my weights will be 0. So in the k plus 1th iteration, my drop will not be same as what I had in the kth iteration, right?
Yeah, so we have not really defined what is significant, and as you're saying, this is not the only criterion. There could be other criteria. It's just one indicative criterion.
Okay, sir.
So yeah, you could, this can be improved upon. There could be others. Okay. Any other question? This is an algorithm we'll develop eventually. Yeah, so let's go back to, by the way, I mean, in case you're, want to just kind of quickly compare, we talked about, lasso corresponding to a prior, and what turns out is that lasso is trying to minimize the L1 norm on W, and that's the same as using a Laplace prior on the weights. This is more from machine learning. We will not show the equivalence here, but the transformation is not very difficult. So this Laplace prior on the weights is what promotes sparsity. On the other hand, if you look at the, so this is a Laplace prior. So you can see this Laplace prior yields a lot of sparsity, whereas the Gaussian is a prior when you use an L2 norm. Okay, so the prior corresponding to L2 norm is the Gaussian prior. And all of you know what the Gaussian looks like, right? I mean, this is called the Gaussian hair. It moves very fast, right? But it converges to a non-sparse solution, whereas the Laplacian is a tortoise, moves slow, but converges to a sparse solution. It can be robust, can help generalization, as was pointed out earlier, right? So what does the Gaussian itself look like? I mean, just contrasting with the Laplacian prior, the Gaussian would be smooth. It'll basically not have this peaking here at 0. This basically says you're yielding a lots of zeros, right? It's peaking at lots of 0 weights. That's not true with Gaussian. I mean, of course, it peaks here at 0, but because it does because it kind of is convex in this region, sorry, because it's concave in this region, it's possible that points fall off very quickly. Whereas here it's sharp and peak, right? It's convex before and convex after the Laplace. So there are multiple ways we can understand the sparsity, how the sparsity happens. All this is very interesting, of course, but let's move on to other applications. I put them in as optional because that's only for those who haven't really done it in an ML course. So here are some concrete supervised learning instances. This is a summary, and all of them follow this loss plus regularizer. A question to all of you: which of these has a closed form solution? Or which of these have closed form solutions? Yes.
Sir, L2 with sir Leicht square, sir. So the
so these two, right?
sixth one, sir. No, sir. Just sixth one because
Only
L1 does
six.
not have a
Correct.
closed form solution, right?
Right. So the last one is the only one to have a closed form solution. All the others you have iterative algorithms. So the rest will be solved using iterative algorithms that we develop in this course.
Sir, is this that A transpose A का inverse वाला solution?
Yes. Yes. You're right. Any other questions? Okay, so what we're doing here is just putting together combinations of loss functions and regularizers. Okay, so you have logistic regression, which is the logistic loss, and that's common in the first and the second. But in the case of SVM, you might have a hinge loss. Could also have multi-class logistic regression. Least squares, that's common with ridge and lasso. Okay, the second component that is changing, that corresponds to the regularizer. So L1 regularizer here, this is L2, and you can see that well, the squares has a solution because both the loss and the regularizer are both amenable to differentiation and an exact solution. Okay, it's by virtue of both parts, the regularizer and the loss function. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. You'll see all the others. I mean, you have L2 regularizer in a couple of other cases, but they don't have closed form solution because the loss part is not amenable to an exact solution. Okay.
Sir, one small doubt. Why is L1 regularizer not there for SVM and multi-class logistic regression?
Oh yeah. So those are possible. Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. It's a very good point. These are only some combinations. The moment you bring in L1, you will have to bring in some notion of proximal. So there'll be a proximal algorithm for the L1 variants.
Sir, is there a way from which we can know that it will have a exact solution or it will not have a closed form solution?
Yeah, typically you'll look at the gradient. Are you able to set the gradient to 0 and come up with a closed form solution? That's how we'll determine. Okay. Right. And we'll see the reason why. Can we move on to the second application? Any questions on this first application? So second application is clustering. Now we're giving this as an instance of continuous optimization. But this will also be treated in discrete optimization. Okay, so okay, in fact, even some of the algorithm we will discuss will have the discrete part inherently. This is an example of unsupervised learning, right? So imagine that you have you have given two things. You're given class these points in gray with no colors, and you're given k, which is the number of clusters. How do you cluster them together? How do you identify these groups? That's a problem in interest. Okay. Now, what the shape of these clusters is also an interesting question. While many algorithms go for convex shapes, there are approaches by which you can also discover non-convex shapes. Somebody had a question? So please mute yourself if you're not speaking. I don't know how to mute everyone. There seems to be some disturbance. So the continuous formulation of clustering often yield convex clusters. See, unless you use a notion of kernels, right? Whereas the discrete versions may not have convex shapes. And I hope you understand what is a convex cluster. We'll define convex sets more formally later on. But the notion of convex set is that any line segment joining 2 points in the set should lie in the same set. Okay, that's the notion of a convex set. Convex if and only if every line segment joining any 2 points in the set lies within the set. Okay, it's not every the line segment. Yeah. Okay. So for the time being, we'll kind of restrict our attention to continuous formulations, which will typically yield you convex clusters. Make this a little darker so that you can read it. So what you do here, given an unsupervised or unlabeled data set where xi's are the feature vectors, you're trying to determine the clusters. Okay, so let's look at examples. Yeah, we'll look at examples with the following notation. We are trying to find clusters C1 to Ck such that each cluster consists of similar instances. Now there's a notion of similar. So how do you characterize similarity? The examples will correspond to, for example, definitions of similarity. So I would like to hear from you. What is the notion of similarity here? What would you expect from measurements of similarity?
Sir, distance.
Okay, there should be distances. Okay, similarity would be measured as decreasing functions of distances. What else? Would you expect some property to be there?
Sir, angle, I mean cosine similarity between 2 points.
Yeah, so you could look at cosine similarity. So yeah, those are examples. You could look at cosine similarity. You could look at polynomial functions of cosine similarity. Okay, those correspond to what we call as polynomial kernels, etc. I mean, that's more of ML. But what else do you expect? So do you expect something from the similarity or something from the distance? Are they just random measures of distances? Do they have, should they satisfy some property? Distances should preferably be what? To seed your thinking, let me just show you an example. What is this capturing? Okay, let me. What is this? There's a D is a distance.
For Euclidean distance.
Well, Euclidean is only one notion. What does this inequality tell you?
Triangle inequality.
Should preferably satisfy triangle inequality. And they're called metrics.
Yeah, metric distance basically.
Yeah. If you are looking at similarities, then you can think of them as kernels. And likewise, if similarity and directly using a kernel, then preferably it should be a kernel. It's called a positive semi-definite kernel. Okay, again, this is more from the ML perspective. If you have done an ML course, great. Otherwise, you can go and read up what's a positive semi-definite kernel. So let me just expand. PSD is positive semi-definite kernel. So yeah, you can have examples of both. So you can have similarity examples as cosine similarity, polynomial functions of cosine similarity, polynomial kernels, etc. But you could also have directly, I mean, distances which influence the similarity as a decreasing function of the distance, which satisfy the triangle inequality. And let's look at examples of that. Somebody mentioned Euclidean distance, right?
Yes, sir.
L1 distance. You can also look at L1 distance, right? So you can say L1 norm of D1 minus D2. Sorry, X1 minus X2. Oh, by the way, I mean, I'm assuming you know what is the, you are all familiar with norms, right? What is L1 norm? It is nothing but sum of the absolute values. Okay, so you'll be summing up all components of X1, I component of X1. Let me actually write it in the same font. So you'll have to basically take the absolute value of X1 ith component and X2's ith component. Hello, sorry. I went wrong. Okay, so you'll take ith component of each of these, X1 and X2. And now when you do clustering, you'll find a partition of the points. What is your goal? Either using distance or directly a similarity measure, right? You can find the clusters, but such that what? You want to cluster such that let's take the example from the previous slide. Okay, so these two, on what basis are trying to cluster? you seem to see some cohesion here between the points in this cluster, some cohesion between the points in this cluster. So how do you measure that cohesiveness?
Sir, one of them would be that the point is near to the uh, its own cluster than the other cluster.
Okay, so yeah, points within a cluster are closer to each other, right? And points in another cluster, right? So that is like what we are saying optimization wise is minimize intercluster distances, correct? Rather intra-cluster. Okay. So so there are two criteria. One is minimize intra-cluster distance, and the other is
Maximize intercluster distance.
yeah. Okay. Okay, so let's try and measure each of these or represent each of these. So when we say minimize intra-cluster distances, that's exactly what we are trying to show through the cohesiveness of points within the cluster. So this is minimizing intra-cluster distances, right? You're trying to make these points close to each other. At the same time, you want to maximize the distance across clusters, points across clusters. And that's where you're trying to say, okay, let the closest point from one cluster and another cluster be actually further away than the furthest point within a single cluster. Right? You want this to be larger than the furthest distance within a cluster, right? Than this. Is that clear? So take these two distances. So we would like the distance in red to be pink to be larger than the distance in blue within a cluster, the largest distance within a single cluster. Is this clear? And that's ideal. Now we may have approximations, surrogates, etc. So let's look at one particular optimization problem. The K means optimization problem. This is one example. It is just one example. Actually speaking, the optimization problem can be written slightly more elaborately. We have compacted it. And what are we trying to do? We are trying to say find the So what you're trying to say is this is 1 upon Ci, the points that belong to that cluster, take the mean of all of them, right? The point X in that cluster belonging to Ci should be close enough to the mean. So okay, so the entire part here is the mean of the cluster. The mean of the cluster, not that minus part. This part is a mean. You want X to be close to the mean in that cluster, and you want to find the clustering such that this is overall minimized. So this actually is a discrete optimization problem. Okay, so at this level, it's a discrete optimization problem. What you have done is the cluster is being implicitly represented using the mean of points within that cluster. So actually speaking, this is already making an assumption that the mean is a good representation of the cluster, right? So if you were to write down the original objective function, it will be a lot more elaborate. This is basically a simplification of the following problem. Let me write down the more elaborate problem. This is what min over not only C1 to Ck, but also min over mu1 to mu k. Oh, sorry, min is already there. Of the same expression, largely the same expressions, except for the part in green I'm going to replace with a mu. So I equals 1 to k, summation over all the points in the ith cluster of x minus mu I, 2 norm squared. Okay. Put a double norm here. Okay, so this turns out that, I mean, it turns out that this is exactly the same. Right? In fact, only the part in the mu. Okay, let me just color this in blue or red. In only this part has been substituted. It turns out that this is actually the best representation in terms of L2 norm. The mu I being represented as 1 upon Ci, summation of all the xj's in Ci, is the best representation of the cluster as for this norm. Okay, so this is it's actually a mixed continuous and discrete optimization problem. So I'll just make a note here. So in its original form, it is a mixed continuous plus discrete optimization problem. Okay, and what turns out is that the discrete component is the Ci's, the continuous is the mu i's. Okay, so let's just highlight them. This so the mu i's, the determination of the mu i's is the discrete component, sorry, continuous component. Whereas the discrete part is a determination of the Ci's. The fact that you're trying to discover the Ci's. That's the discrete component. What we have done is the continuous we have actually solved already, and that's why I'm calling it a, I mean, I'm giving it as an instance of the continuous optimization problem as well. It turns out that the solution is to the mu i's is exactly this. Okay. Okay. Now this mixed discrete continuous optimization problem cannot be solved in one shot. It's iteratively solved. You solve for the mu i's, then the Ci's, and the mu i's, and the Ci's. Right. So because of this implicit representation, the problem looks a lot more compact, but actually it's not as simple. Right? You have to actually elaborate in terms of mu i's and Ci's and solve them alternatively. So that's my concluding comment. This can be viewed as a joint discrete and continuous optimization problem. Any questions on this? Let's look at the next example if you are all fine with this one. The third is principal component analysis. This is again an instance of unsupervised learning. I'm going to give a simple description here. Again, I have some extra optional slides at the end if you don't have this primer already. What happens in principal component analysis is that you're given unlabeled data. Okay, let me give the picture here. So the idea here is that you already have the data in some space. Okay, some space X. I'm now trying to compact my X using the principal components that we'll see soon. Such that you can recover the original X as effectively as possible. Okay, so let's call this a recovered X. Okay, and the loss is basically going to be, let's call this recovered x, but let's give it a name x tilde. So the loss is just going to be as follows. You're going to say how far is my x from my x tilde, right? And you want to minimize this loss with respect to the principal component, the transformation. So if you want to call this, give some name, let's say this is a transformation u. Okay, so there's a transformation u that takes you. So you want to minimize the loss with respect to this u transformation. In fact, yeah, I'll put the u right here in the bottleneck. So this is a basic idea. So let's see how this can be elaborated upon. Given unlabeled data, xi are the feature vectors. So think of, you know, representing images, and we in the extra slides at the end I've given an example of faces, right? Lots of face images, and let's say I'm trying to compress the face images. In fact, let me just run through this very intuitive example here. Like, so imagine that you have lots of faces, and I'm trying to now identify these principal component. These will look like the principal component faces, such that if I take suitable scalar coefficients and scalar combinations of these faces, I can recover back any face. One face is basically showing the outline. Another face is basically showing the head a bit more, right? And this last one is basically showing the facial features a bit more. So any image, face image, could be recovered using this. So let's go back to the I said this was anyways for you to brush up if you haven't done this. Okay, let's build this further. So you're given unlabeled data where xi are the features, and what you're trying to do is goal identify lower dimensional. So the faces I showed you are lower dimensional, but they are meaningful. Such as the face features, extra reading. But you want to do that such that think of the original data that you capture. Now, what you want to capture that can be boiled down to the notion of variance. The direction of maximum spread. Right? The directions, it's not necessarily one, directions of maximum spread of the xi's, right? So the x's which are the higher dimensional data. Trying to find a lower dimensional meaningful representation of the higher dimensional data such that the directions of maximum spread are captured, and this is basically like saying the variance. It's like this amounts, okay, to basically finding the variance directions, right? So when you say maximum spread, those are the directions of maximum variance. So I'll let me use spread as variance. Okay, we'll elaborate on this subsequently, but for the time being, you can think of simple transformations, right? Okay, let me show you one transformation which may not be the most satisfactory, but which is nevertheless something that would come to your mind, right? So let's say face. Let's take the face example. You have the original data set x1, x2, and r2, and let's say I compress them into just x1 plus x2 divided by 2. This is a simple compression. So think of this as one instance of the u, or the compressor. We will give it a formal name, compressor. Now, is this good? Well, it's good if you have data of this form, right? If the data is spread like this, then in fact the direction of maximum variance is x1 plus x2 by 2, this direction. So this makes sense. But you want to pose an optimization problem such that given such data, x1 plus x2 by 2 turns out to be the solution. How do you do that? Okay, so let's what is the notion of a compressor here? The compressor here is that gives you x1 plus x2 by 2, but now you can also decompress. So let's look at the decompression. Okay, so the goal is to find the compressors and corresponding decompressors such that after you compress and then decompress, you get proximity. So here we have given some specific names. Okay, the compressors, let's actually denote them in blue, and decompressors will denote them in pink. So and let's actually with respect to the same example, let me show the same example here. Let me compress this image a bit. Okay, so on this example, what's happening? You're taking x1 plus x2 by 2. That's actually a compression problem. You're compressing already. But what would be a decompression? Anyone would like to suggest? How do you decompress? I want to recover back the x1 and x2.
Multiply by U transpose.
Well, by U is itself x1 plus x2 by 2. So I multiply by U transpose, you're saying, but what is that going to correspond to in the simple example? It would be what? What would x1? Basically, you want to recover back x1, x2, right? What is x1 for this data? For such data, what is x1? It is nothing but.
Sir, if we try to track the linear combination of the eigenvectors of x, can we do that? So x transpose x, maybe can we do like that?
So what you're trying to give is a general algorithm. I appreciate that very much, right? When you say U transpose, etc. I'm asking for the simple example. How would you decompress? Given the fact that x1 and x2 are perfectly linearly correlated, your decompressor would be what? Kind of identity, right? I mean, identity in the sense it'll be x1 plus x2 by 2 and x1 plus x2 by 2. Do you get it? The whatever we have compressed. So let's call this x tilde, right? So x1 will be x tilde, x2 will be x tilde. Do you get that?
Yes, sir.
So in this case, the decompression is very simple. Okay, let's give it a name. This is x tilde. So x1 is just x tilde. But yes, what you were alluding to are what we would. How would you obtain such decompressor? Okay. Turns out that we are making some more assumption here. It turns out that this compressor and decompressor must have this relation that V is U transpose. Okay. Why are we saying this? And I'll tell you the reason. Going back to this image, let's again, this is going to be a canonical running example for us. So let's copy this here as well. Okay, so this compressor was basically saying, okay, I'll take x1 plus x2 by 2. Now, how that was arrived at needs to be seen, but the intuition was that the points seem to be perfectly linearly correlated, right? An assumption was made here to arrive at this x tilde. X tilde makes sense under the assumption x tilde and the corresponding deconstructor assumes the following, that the compressor is preserving magnitudes. Okay. What does it assume? Let's I'll just type it here. The compressor U preserves magnitudes. What do you mean by magnitude? I mean, if we are saying that for example, U itself doesn't have unbounded norms. Okay, so if you are in some finite, I mean, you're in some bounded space, you remain in a bounded space. You don't just suddenly go blast all the way to infinity, right? You're not looking at a big bang explosion here. So the transformation should preserve some magnitude. Okay, so sanity. So for example, you can just say that for every if you're looking at the, I think the columns of u, right? You're looking at something like um, ux, okay, so vxi and then ux. So you're looking at the rows of the columns of u. So let's say the column of u is ui, and the norm is 1. It's a manifestation of that. It preserves magnitude or has bounded magnitude. That's good enough, right? Has bounded magnitude. A second important assumption that still is very common sense, but the second thing which might require a little bit more thinking is that if you're going to use u for transforming a point x1, okay, now let me use a slightly different notation instead of x1 x2, which correspond to the coordinates here. Okay, let's look at vectors v1 v2. So when you apply u on a vector v1 and when you apply u on another vector v1 prime, v and v prime say, and if v and v prime are uncorrelated, so each of these points, just think of this as one point. Okay, let me actually use a map here. So let's say these points are v1, this is a v2. They're totally independent points. So they're not independent points. I'm sorry. Let's say this is v2. These are right. So if 2 points are uncorrelated, v1 and v2 are uncorrelated, then after transformation also they should remain uncorrelated. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that this solution obtained is the PCA solution, but that seems to be the intuition. I mean, obviously we have not solved it exactly here because the points are in some two-dimensional space with certain finite precision. But the goal is that if v1 and v2 are uncorrelated, then u of v1 and u of v2, that the two vectors transformed, are also correlated. Okay, so to look at this in the strictest sense, you'll have to look at distributions. But let me know if you understand what I'm talking about. If you have any questions, this is again. Any questions? So we think of v1 and v2 from the point of view of random variables. These are random variables, okay? I mean, moment we talk about correlation coefficient, you need to think in terms of expectation, right, of the covariance suitably normalized. The covariance suitably normalized.
Sir, I have a doubt. Sir, if we want to enforce the second point, wouldn't it be very expensive part? Like I have to check with all other n-1 that it is not similar to me.
You don't have to. So because in an expected, so this is again in an expected sense. Okay, let me write down. In an expected sense. So you don't have to do this on all points. And it turns out that this can be solved using the notion of, we'll show how later on this can be this constraint can be put using Lagrange multipliers. Okay. And when you put this constraint using Lagrange multipliers, you will get basically that this V equals U transpose. Decompressor should be such that it is U transpose. Is that fine?
Okay, sir.
So when solved using constraint optimization, which we'll talk about later. We'll specifically talk about Lagrange multipliers. It turns out that this is exactly yielding the V equals U transpose. Okay, so I've not really posed the optimization problem in details as I would like to, but obviously we don't have the all the wherewithal right now to do that. So with this assumption, so this is an assumption already inbuilt. Like in the clustering case, I built the assumption that the solution to the problem will be where the means coincide with where the mu's coincide with the means of the point of the clusters. So likewise, this is an implicit byproduct of certain constraint. Under this, the PCA optimization, principal component analysis optimization problem is exactly this. You will have xi minus UU transpose xi, the whole norm square, to be minimized. This U transpose U, so slightly note the slight difference here between U transpose U, which is basically V is U transpose U is I, which basically says that each UI is has basically norm 1, right? I talked about this bounded magnitude case. Okay, so this is the green part. UI is 1. U transpose U is I, and V is U transpose. Under plugging in that outcome of the constraint optimization, you basically get xi minus UU transpose xi norm square should be minimized. This is a PCA optimization problem. Now, sorry, this has got repeated. In the extra slides I have at the end, I talk about this dimension standard reduction, and I give two perspectives. One perspective is minimizing the reconstruction error, exactly what I showed, and this is the perspective, error reduction perspective. You have x and RD, you're compressing and then trying to get x tilde close enough to x. And what I also brought out in the optimization is the maximizing variance of projected data. So that's the intuition I gave in the while posing the optimization problem. So if the data points are centered, you can look at the variance of the data post projection, and you want to maximize. You want to find those directions which maximize the variance. Okay, so it's basically PCA finds the rotation of the original coordinate system in the form of the PE and expresses x in that system P, so that each new coordinate expresses as much of the variability in x can be expressed by linear combination of the entry. So we took one example of linear combination, which is just the average. But here we are trying to discover that linear combination. So this is now we are going slightly away from the perfectly linearly correlated points, right? So here, instead of what I was showing earlier, this one, right? So just let's contrast. In fact, let's contrast this example. This is a very simplistic example. With what is being shown here. So here, the points are actually not lying on this x1 plus x2 by 2, right? And then what you're trying to do is look at the variance, but it turns out that the direction of maximum variance is still this. It will still be x1 plus x2 by 2, but you will get a second principal component which will capture probably one of these directions, right? Depends. I mean, when we solve it exactly, we don't know, but I would think that will tend to be one of these directions. So it's a high variance direction. Okay, so these are just extra slides for you to get an idea. I've also shown how I can find principal components one at a time. Okay, let's go back to the third example. Unless you want me to delve more into it, I'm just going to. I don't want this to become a machine learning course, but I'm trying to give you sufficient machine learning insight so that you can deal with the optimization problem, or at least appreciate the optimization problem. Okay, so now let's go back to the next example, the application number 4, matrix completion. Okay, so we're done with principal component analysis. let's look at matrix completion. Oh, we have only 3 minutes left. Maybe we'll do matrix completion in the next class. If you have any questions, please ask me now. We'll continue with matrix completion in the next class. Any questions? Okay, so I'll just get started with the next topic. Won't delve into it too much right now. All of us have watched movies. We've watched movies on Netflix, possibly on Amazon, and we see recommendations. We see family members possibly be watching similar movies, and maybe it's possible that within the same Netflix account, 3 different roles or 3 different IDs are watching different movies. Some of the IDs are watching similar movies. How are these recommendations made? One way you can make these recommendations by posing matrix completion problem. Now, what's the basic? What is the matrix we're talking about? Matrix of users and movies, right? Matrix of users and products, and you want to complete it in such a way that the previously suggested movies or the watched movies are consistent with what is being suggested. So let me just give another example. Let's say we have users and products, and we have a whole bunch of question marks. So certain users have used certain products. It's not clear whether certain products have been consumed. Maybe the data is missing. Maybe they have not yet even explored that product, and maybe it's possible that they didn't want that product. Okay, so we want to fill up those question marks. It's not that all the question marks will be tick marks. Some of them may be negative because the user doesn't simply have preferences for certain products. Okay, so this is the idea. How maybe you can think about how you would pose this as an optimization problem. Could we pose this in terms of something like PCA, where you're looking at some orthogonal but matrix, but you orthogonal matrix, but a decomposition of this large user product matrix into simpler matrices. Those simpler matrices possibly project the users and products into a lower dimensional space. Okay, give some thought to it. What I'll also talk about in the next class is the notion of a matrix, norm. We have a vector norm, right? There's also a notion of a matrix norm. So I'll possibly also give you some of my extra optional notes from convex optimization, where I talk a lot about matrix norms. So we will also or build on matrix norms. Yeah. If there's any concluding question, we'll take it. Otherwise, we'll stop for today.
Sir, like what type of ML problems can't be looked as optimization problems? Like, can every ML problem reformulate as optimization problem?
So that's a good question. So there have been cases when tree building. Now, what is decision tree building optimizing? For that matter, even boosting, ADA boost, right? The loss function looks a little contrived. So there are many cases where algorithms have been defined very intuitively, like decision tree, right? You can actually pose an optimization problem for decision tree building. It's just going to be totally combinatorial. It's just going to be an effort to write down the optimization problem. So there are many ML algorithms which are intuitive, for which there's an implicit optimization problem driving the algorithm which has not been yet articulated, right? So I would say the optimization problems always are implicitly, just that it might be difficult to write. Does that help?
Yes, sir.
And in most such cases, you can show that the algorithm is suboptimal, where it's never going to give you the optimal solution. Hardly ever. It's very large search space. Thanks.
Okay,
thanks for a nice question. Okay, thanks. We'll meet on Monday, 2 p.m. I'll please again, I'm requesting. I'll just go back to the Moodle. please feel free to look at the Moodle slides posted for the next class as the same as the pre-recorded lectures. So I'll keep deleting the pre-recorded lectures as and when I put in the new lectures. So you could use the pre-recorded material. The speed at which we are moving is faster, but we some of them we may even put them as optional reading. But largely I'll put the next upcoming pre-recorded lecture is the provides you enough material for you to read up in case you're interested. Not mandatory though. Thanks.